The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Clarence House as King Charles III sat in his private study, reviewing the day's schedule. The golden light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the stack of papers before him. It was a Tuesday in late October, and the autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter's approach. Charles adjusted his reading glasses and picked up the leather-bound diary that contained his royal engagements for the coming weeks. His finger traced down the entries until it stopped at a particular date that made him pause. November 15th was circled in red ink with a notation that read, "Princess, an official visit to Cardiff Children's Hospital, 2 p.m." A gentle smile crossed his face as he thought of his sister, and had always been the most dedicated member of the royal family when it came to charitable work. Her commitment to various causes, particularly those involving children and health care, had earned her widespread respect both within the monarchy and among the British public. This particular visit to Cardiff was something she had been planning for months, working closely with the hospital administrators to ensure maximum benefit for the young patients. The sound of heels clicking on marble flooring announced Camilla's approach. The Queen Consort entered the study with her usual grace, carrying a cup of tea and wearing a concerned expression that Charles had come to recognize over their many years together. "Good morning, darling," she said, setting the tea down on his desk. "I trust you slept well." "Well enough," Charles replied, looking up from his diary. "Though I must say, this schedule is becoming increasingly demanding. Sometimes I wonder how Mother managed it all for so many years." Camilla moved to stand behind his chair, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "You're doing wonderfully, Charles. The people love you, and you're bringing your own unique touch to the monarchy." Charles reached up to pat one of her hands. "Thank you, my dear. Your support means everything to me." He gestured to the diary. "I was just reviewing Anne's upcoming visit to Cardiff. It's remarkable how she maintains such an active schedule at her age." Something flickered across Camilla's face, so quickly that Charles almost missed it. But there it was, a tightening around her eyes, a slight pursing of her lips. She moved away from him, walking to the window and gazing out at the gardens. "Yes, well," she said carefully, and has always been energetic in her pursuits. The tone was neutral enough, but Charles had been married to Camilla long enough to detect the subtle undercurrents in her voice. There was something she wasn't saying, something that was troubling her about Anne's visit. "Is everything all right?" he asked, setting down his reading glasses. "You seem somewhat distracted this morning." Camilla turned from the window, her expression carefully composed. "Oh, it's nothing really. Just some concerns I've been having about the scheduling. The royal calendar is so packed these days, and I worry about overlapping commitments." "Overlapping commitments." Charles frowned. "I don't recall any conflicts with Anne's Cardiff visit." "Well, not conflicts exactly," Camilla said, moving to sit in the chair across from his desk. "But I've been thinking about the public relations aspect. You know how important it is to maintain a coordinated approach to our charitable work." Charles leaned back in his chair, studying his wife's face. In all their years together, through courtship, marriage, and now their joint role in leading the monarchy, Camilla had never shown anything but respect and admiration for Princess, and, if anything, she had often spoken of Anne's work ethic as an example for other members of the royal family to follow. "I'm not sure I understand your concern," Charles said slowly. "Anne's visit to Cardiff has been planned for months. The hospital is expecting her, the media arrangements are in place, and she's genuinely excited about meeting the children." Camilla shifted in her chair, her hands fidgeting with the pearl necklace she wore. "Of course, and I would never want to interfere with Anne's charitable work. It's just that I've been speaking with some of our advisors about the overall image we're projecting as a royal family." "Our advisors?" Charles raised an eyebrow. "Which advisors specifically?" "Well, primarily Sir Malcolm Hartwell from the Communications Department," Camilla replied. "He's been expressing some concerns about the frequency of Anne's public appearances and whether they might be overshadowing other important royal activities." Charles felt a knot forming in his stomach. Sir Malcolm Hartwell was a relatively new addition to their staff, someone Camilla had recommended for the position. He was efficient and well-connected, but Charles had always found him to be somewhat calculating in his approach to royal public relations. Overshadowing in what way? Charles asked, his voice taking on a slightly sharper edge. "Oh, darling, please don't misunderstand me," Camilla said quickly, reaching across the desk to touch his hand. "I have nothing but admiration for Anne's work. It's just that when one member of the royal family is constantly in the spotlight, it can create an imbalance in public perception." Charles pulled his hand away gently but firmly, "and is in the spotlight, as you put it, because she works tirelessly for causes that matter. She doesn't seek attention for its own sake. She seeks to make a difference." "I know that, and I respect it enormously," Camilla insisted. "But we also have to think about the bigger picture. Your reign is still relatively new, and it's important that you be seen as the primary focus of royal charitable work." The words hung in the air between them, and Charles felt something cold settle in his chest. He had suspected for some time that there might be tensions brewing within the family structure, but he had hoped that his wife and sister would continue to work together harmoniously for the good of the monarchy. "Are you suggesting that Anne should cancel her visit to Cardiff?" he asked, his voice very quiet. "Not cancel, exactly," Camilla said, her words coming more quickly now. "Perhaps postpone it, or maybe modify it in some way. Sir Malcolm has some ideas about how we could restructure the visit to better serve our overall communication strategy." Charles stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the same window where Camilla had been standing earlier, his hands clasped behind his back. The gardens that had seemed so peaceful moments before now appeared somehow distant and cold. "My sister has been serving this family and this country with distinction for over 50 years, he said without turning around. "She has earned a right to pursue her charitable interests without interference from communication strategies or public relations concerns." "Charles, please," Camilla said, rising from her chair. "I'm not trying to interfere. I'm trying to help. We're all in this together, and we need to present a united front." "A united front," Charles repeated, finally turning to face her. "And you believe that undermining Anne's work serves that purpose?" "I'm not undermining anyone's work," Camilla protested. "I'm simply suggesting that we coordinate our efforts more effectively." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Charles's private secretary, a dignified man named Henry Morrison who had served the royal family for over 2 decades, entered with his characteristic discreet manner. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," Morrison said, "but Princess Anne's office is called to confirm the final details for the Cardiff visit. They wanted to ensure that all security arrangements are in place and that the media coverage meets with your approval." Charles looked at Morrison, then at Camilla, whose face had gone slightly pale. "Tell Princess Anne's office that they have my complete support and that I look forward to hearing about the success of her visit," he said firmly. "Very good, sir," Morrison replied, making a note in his ever-present notebook. "Shall I also confirm that there have been no changes to the planned schedule?" "No changes whatsoever," Charles said, his eyes not leaving Camilla's face. "Princess Anne's visit will proceed exactly as planned." After Morrison left, the silence in the room was deafening. Camilla sat back down, her composure beginning to crack around the edges. "Charles, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said, her voice taking on a pleading quality. "I'm not the enemy here. I'm your wife, and I'm trying to protect your interests." "My interests?" Charles moved back to his desk, but remained standing. "My interests are perfectly aligned with supporting my family members in their charitable work. That has always been my position, and it always will be, even when that charitable work begins to compete with your own initiatives?" Camilla asked, and immediately looked as if she regretted the words. Charles stared at her, feeling as if he were seeing his wife clearly for the first time in months. The gentle, supportive partner he had known for so many years seemed to have been replaced by someone he didn't recognize, someone capable of viewing his sister's selfless work as a threat to be managed. "Compete," he said slowly. "You see Anne's visit to sick children as competition?" That's not what I meant, Camilla said quickly, but Charles held up a hand to stop her. I think, he said, his voice carrying the weight of royal authority, that this conversation has revealed some concerning attitudes that need to be addressed. However, that will have to wait. I have a meeting with the Prime Minister in an hour, and I need to prepare. Camilla stood up, her face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Charles, please don't let this create a rift between us. I was only trying to help. I know you believe that, Charles replied, sitting back down at his desk and picking up his reading glasses. But perhaps your definition of help and mine are not as aligned as we thought. After Camilla left the room, Charles sat alone with his thoughts and the morning light that no longer seemed quite as warm as it had an hour earlier. He opened the diary again and looked at the notation for Anne's Cardiff visit. Below it, in Camilla's handwriting, he noticed for the first time a small question mark that hadn't been there before. The sight of it made his blood run cold. How long had this been going on? How many other royal engagements had been subjected to Camilla's scrutiny? How many times had his wife positioned herself as a gatekeeper for the charitable work that was the very heart of what the royal family represented? Charles reached for his telephone and dialed a number he knew by heart. After 2 rings, a familiar voice answered. And speaking. Hello, sister, Charles said, his voice warmer than it had been all morning. I just wanted to call and tell you how much I'm looking forward to hearing about your Cardiff visit next week. The work you're doing with that hospital is truly exceptional. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Thank you, Charles. That means a great deal coming from you. I must admit, I was beginning to wonder if there might be some concerns about the visit. I've been getting some rather odd questions from various palace offices. Charles felt his jaw tighten. What sort of questions? Oh, nothing specific really. Just inquiries about whether the visit is absolutely necessary, whether it might be better to send a representative instead, that sort of thing. I assumed it was just normal protocol, but it struck me as unusual given how long this has been planned. Those inquiries were not made with my knowledge or approval, Charles said firmly. Your visit to Cardiff has my complete support, and I want you to know that any attempt to interfere with it goes against my express wishes. I see, and said, and Charles could hear the understanding in her voice. His sister had always been perceptive about family dynamics, and she would read between the lines of what he wasn't saying. Well, I appreciate your support, Charles. It means everything to be able to do this work without worrying about palace politics. You should never have to worry about palace politics when it comes to helping sick children, Charles said. And I intend to make sure that message is understood by everyone in our household. After ending the call, Charles sat back in his chair and tried to process what had just transpired. The conversation with Camilla had revealed a side of his wife that he had never seen before, and it troubled him deeply. More than that, it suggested a broader pattern of behavior that could threaten the very foundations of how the royal family operated. He thought about the early days of their marriage, when Camilla had seemed so supportive of the entire family's charitable efforts. She had spoken admiringly of Anne's work ethic and dedication. She had praised the way the Princess Royal managed to maintain such a demanding schedule while still fulfilling all her royal obligations. When had that admiration turned into something else? When had Camilla begun to see in success as a threat rather than an asset to the monarchy? Charles opened his desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound notebook that he used for personal reflections. He had started keeping it shortly after becoming king, finding that writing helped him process the complex emotions and decisions that came with the crown. October 24th, he wrote, "Disturbing conversation with C. This morning regarding Anne's Cardiff visit. Concerned about motivations and broader implications. Need to investigate further." He paused, pen hovering over the paper, then continued. Question, how many other family activities has C attempted to influence? Must speak with Morrison about recent communications patterns. The sound of footsteps in the hallway reminded him that his day was far from over. The Prime Minister would be arriving soon, followed by a series of meetings that would take him well into the evening. But throughout all of those official duties, a part of his mind would be focused on the growing suspicion that his wife had been working behind the scenes to undermine his sister's charitable work. As Charles prepared for his next meeting, he made a mental note to pay closer attention to the dynamics within his household staff. Sir Malcolm Hartwell's recommendations would need to be scrutinized more carefully. The communications department's approach to family scheduling would require his direct oversight. And, most importantly, he would need to ensure that his sister and never again had to wonder whether her decades of service to the monarchy were truly valued. The morning that had started with such promise had become something quite different, and Charles found himself wondering what other surprises might be waiting for him in the days ahead. One thing was certain. He would not allow anyone, no matter how close to him personally, to interfere with the charitable work that gave meaning and purpose to the royal family's existence. The battle lines, though not yet fully visible, had been drawn. In his heart, Charles knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation about power, influence, and the true purpose of the monarchy in a modern world. But for now, he had a country to lead and a sister to support, and those responsibilities would guide every decision he made in the challenging days ahead. 3 days had passed since Charles's unsettling conversation with Camilla, and the king found himself paying attention to details he had previously overlooked. Every interaction, every suggestion, every seemingly casual comment from his wife now carried a weight it hadn't possessed before. The morning routine that had once been a source of comfort now felt like a careful dance around unspoken tensions. Charles sat in the breakfast room of Clarence House, mechanically stirring his tea while reviewing the morning newspapers. The familiar rustle of pages and the gentle clink of china against saucer provided a soundtrack to his troubled thoughts. Across from him, Camilla maintained her usual elegant composure, occasionally commenting on articles or sharing observations about the day's headlines. "Oh, look," she said, pointing to a small item in the Times. "There's a lovely piece about the children's ward at St. Mary's Hospital. They've just received a new piece of equipment that will help with pediatric heart surgery." Charles looked up from his paper. "That's wonderful news. Medical advances for children are always cause for celebration." "Indeed," Camilla agreed, but then added with what seemed like casual interest, "I wonder if we might consider arranging a royal visit to St. Mary's. It would be such good publicity for the advancement of children's health care." The suggestion hung in the air, and Charles felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. St. Mary's Hospital was in London, easily accessible for a royal visit. More significantly, a high-profile visit to St. Mary's on November 15th would naturally overshadow Anne's visit to the Cardiff Children's Hospital on the same date. A visit to St. Mary's would indeed be valuable, Charles said carefully. "When were you thinking this might take place?" "Oh, I hadn't thought of a specific date," Camilla replied, though something in her tone suggested otherwise. "Perhaps sometime in the next few weeks, when the calendar isn't too crowded." Charles set down his teacup with deliberate precision. "The next few weeks are quite full, as you know. Anne's visit to Cardiff, the state banquet for the German delegation, the opening of Parliament's winter session." "Yes, of course," Camilla said quickly. "I just thought that if an opportunity arose, it might be worth considering. Children's health care is such an important cause." The irony was not lost on Charles. His wife was invoking the very cause that Anne had championed for decades, children's health care, as a justification for what appeared to be an attempt to overshadow his sister's work in that exact field. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Henry Morrison, carrying his usual leather portfolio and wearing an expression that Charles had learned to interpret as diplomatically concerned. "Good morning, Your Majesty, Your Majesty," Morrison said with a slight bow. "Forgive the interruption, but I have some matters that require your attention." "Of course, Henry," Charles replied. "What's on your mind?" Morrison opened his portfolio and withdrew a folder. "I've been reviewing the correspondence regarding Princess Anne's upcoming visit to Cardiff, and I'm afraid there have been some unusual developments." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "What sort of developments?" "Well, sir, it appears that there have been several inquiries made to various departments about the Princess Royal schedule. Questions about security requirements, media coordination, transportation arrangements, all the standard logistical elements. That sounds perfectly normal, Charles said, though something in Morrison's manner suggested it was anything but normal. Yes, sir, except that these inquiries have been coming from multiple sources, often asking for the same information. And some of the requests have been, how shall I put it, unusually detailed. Camilla had grown very still, her attention seemingly focused on her morning tea, but Charles noticed that she had stopped eating and was listening intently to every word. Detailed in what way? Charles asked. Morrison hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. For instance, there have been requests for exact timing of the Princess Royal's arrival, specific details about which hospital departments she will visit, and even inquiries about alternative dates when the visit might be postponed. Postponed? Charles's voice sharpened. On whose authority were inquiries made about postponement? That's just it, sir. The requests have been coming through various channels, and it's not entirely clear who is coordinating them. Some appear to originate from the communications department, others from scheduling, and still others from what appears to be external sources. Charles glanced at Camilla, who had finally looked up from her tea, but avoided meeting his eyes directly. External sources? Public relations consultants, media advisors, that sort of thing, Morrison explained. It's created quite a bit of confusion among the staff, as different departments are receiving conflicting information about the status of the visit. The breakfast room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Charles could feel anger building in his chest, not the quick flash of irritation that came with minor inconveniences, but the slow, steady burn of betrayal. Henry, he said finally, I want you to send a message to all departments and any external consultants who may be involved. Princess Anne's visit to Cardiff will proceed exactly as originally planned. No changes, no delays, no modifications. Anyone who suggests otherwise is acting without royal authority. Very good, sir, Morrison replied, making notes in his book. Shall I also investigate the source of these conflicting communications? Yes, Charles said firmly. I want to know exactly who has been making these inquiries and on whose behalf. After Morrison left, the silence between Charles and Camilla stretched uncomfortably. She continued to fidget with her teacup, occasionally taking small sips but clearly avoiding conversation. Is there something you'd like to tell me? Charles asked finally. About what? Camilla replied, though her voice carried a defensive edge that confirmed his suspicions. About the inquiries Morrison mentioned. About the confusion among the staff regarding Anne's visit. Camilla set down her cup and looked directly at him for the first time since Morrison's arrival. Charles, I think you're reading too much into routine administrative communications. Routine. Charles felt his voice rise slightly and made an effort to control it. Multiple departments receiving conflicting information about a royal visit is routine. Sometimes wires get crossed, Camilla said. It happens in any large organization. And the external consultants? The public relations advisors? Are they also part of routine administrative communications? Camilla's composure began to crack around the edges. I may have mentioned to Sir Malcolm that we should explore all our options for maximizing the positive impact of royal charitable visits. Our options, Charles repeated, which apparently include undermining Anne's work. I am not undermining anyone's work, Camilla said, her voice rising to match his. I'm trying to ensure that the royal family's charitable efforts are as effective and well-coordinated as possible. Charles stood up from the table, his breakfast forgotten. By creating confusion? By making inquiries about postponement? By involving external consultants in internal royal matters? By thinking strategically about our public image, Camilla shot back. Something that apparently no one else in this family is willing to do. The words hung between them like a gauntlet thrown down. Charles stared at his wife, seeing clearly for the first time the extent of her ambition and the lengths to which she was apparently willing to go to advance what she perceived as their mutual interests. Our public image, he said slowly, is not served by sabotaging my sister's charitable work. I'm not sabotaging anything, Camilla insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I'm trying to create opportunities for you to be seen as the leader you are. At Anne's expense. If necessary, yes. The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Camilla immediately looked as if she regretted the words, but they could not be taken back. Charles walked to the window and stared out at the gardens, trying to process what he had just heard. His wife, the woman he had loved and supported through years of public scrutiny and private challenges, had just admitted that she was willing to undermine his sister's charitable work if it served their political interests. "How long has this been going on?" he asked without turning around. "Charles, how long?" His voice carried the full weight of royal authority. Camilla was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and defensive. "Sir Malcolm suggested that we needed to be more strategic about royal public appearances several months ago. He felt that some members of the family were receiving disproportionate media attention. Some members meaning Anne and Edward, even William and Catherine sometimes. Malcolm felt that as the king and queen consort, we should be the primary focus of royal charitable activities." Charles turned from the window, his face dark with anger. "And you agreed with this assessment?" "I thought it was worth considering," Camilla said. "You've worked so hard to establish yourself as king. I didn't want to see your efforts overshadowed by my own family, by anyone." Charles returned to his chair, but did not sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, his hands gripping the back so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked. "Do you understand the damage this could cause?" "I've tried to protect your interests," Camilla said, but she sounded less certain than before. "You've created a situation where my own staff is confused about royal protocol, where my sister is questioning whether her decades of service are valued, and where external consultants are influencing internal family matters. How exactly does any of that protect my interests?" Camilla stood up as well, her own anger finally surfacing. "Because your sister gets more positive press coverage in a month than you get in 6 months, and that's not fair. You're the king, Charles. You should be the one receiving credit for the royal family's charitable work." "Credit," Charles said, his voice deadly quiet. "You think this is about credit, isn't it?" Camilla challenged. "Isn't that what monarchy is about in the modern age? Public perception, media coverage, maintaining relevance." Charles felt something cold settle in his chest. The woman standing before him, arguing that his sister's charitable work should be diminished for the sake of media coverage, seemed like a stranger. Where was the Camilla who had supported him through his darkest hours? Where was the woman who had understood that service, not publicity, was the true purpose of their position? "If that's what you think monarchy is about," he said finally, "then you understand it far less than I believed." Camilla's face went pale. "Charles, that's not what I meant." "I think it's exactly what you meant," he replied. "And I think it explains everything that's been happening over the past few months." He moved toward the door, but Camilla called out to stop him. "Where are you going?" "To clean up the mess you've created," Charles said without turning around. "And to ensure that my sister receives the support she deserves." "Charles, please," Camilla said, her voice breaking slightly. "Don't let this destroy us." He paused at the doorway and looked back at her. "I'm not the one who's been destroying anything." Charles left the breakfast room and walked quickly through the corridors of Clarence's house, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just learned. The conversation had confirmed his worst fears. Camilla had been actively working to undermine Anne's charitable activities, and she had been doing it for months. As he reached his private office, Charles felt the full weight of betrayal settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about a single hospital visit or even about media coverage. This was about fundamental values, about what the monarchy represented, and about whether his own wife shared his vision for what their roles should be. He picked up his phone and dialed Anne's number again. This time, when she answered, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "And I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Over the past few months, have you noticed any changes in how your charitable activities are being handled? Any unusual obstacles or delays?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Actually, yes. I've been meaning to mention it, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. There have been several instances where visits I've planned have been questioned or delayed for reasons that seemed rather arbitrary. Charles closed his eyes. Can you give me specific examples? The children's cancer ward at Birmingham Children's Hospital. I was supposed to visit in September, but it was postponed twice due to scheduling conflicts that never really made sense. The opening of the new rehabilitation center in Manchester was moved to a smaller, less public ceremony. And there have been several occasions where I've been advised to send a representative instead of attending personally. Who gave you this advice? It's been coming through various channels, and said. Sometimes through my own office, sometimes through central scheduling. But the common thread seems to be a suggestion that my presence isn't necessarily required for these events. Charles felt his anger building again. And I want you to know that none of these suggestions came from me. In fact, they directly contradict my wishes. I suspected as much, and said. It didn't sound like something you would approve of, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I'm going to get to the bottom of this, Charles promised, and I'm going to make sure it stops immediately. After ending the call, Charles sat alone in his office, contemplating the full scope of what had been revealed. Camilla's interference hadn't been limited to Anne's Cardiff visit. It had been a systematic campaign to reduce the Princess Royal's public profile and charitable impact. The betrayal ran deeper than he had imagined, and the consequences would be more far-reaching than he had feared. But one thing was certain. He would not allow this to continue, no matter what the personal cost might be. The second act of this family drama was drawing to a close, but Charles suspected that the most difficult scenes were yet to come. The following morning brought with it a peculiar tension that seemed to permeate every corner of Clarence House. Charles had spent most of the previous evening in his study, making phone calls and reviewing documents that Henry Morrison had gathered regarding the suspicious communications about Anne's charitable activities. What he had discovered was far worse than he had initially suspected. As Charles dressed for the day, he could hear Camilla moving about in her adjacent dressing room, preparing for what she undoubtedly hoped would be a normal day of royal duties. The sounds of her morning routine, the gentle closing of drawers, the soft footsteps on carpet, the murmur of conversation with her personal maid, created an almost surreal backdrop to the storm of emotions brewing in his mind. He had always prided himself on being a fair man, someone who listened to all sides of a story before making judgments. But the evidence Morrison had compiled over the past 24 hours painted a picture so clear and damning that Charles found it difficult to maintain his characteristic diplomatic composure. At precisely 8 o'clock, there was a discreet knock on his study door. Morrison entered, carrying a thick folder that Charles had come to dread seeing. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Morrison said, his usual professional demeanor tinged with obvious discomfort. "I have the information you requested." Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Please sit down, Henry, and close the door behind you." Morrison did as instructed, then opened the folder with the careful precision of a man handling explosive materials. "I'm afraid what I've discovered is rather more extensive than we initially suspected." "Show me." Morrison withdrew a series of documents and spread them across the desk. "These are copies of communications between various members of the royal staff and external consultants over the past 6 months. I've organized them chronologically to show the pattern of activity." Charles put on his reading glasses and began examining the papers. The first document was dated 4 months earlier, a memo from Sir Malcolm Hartwell to Camilla's private secretary suggesting a comprehensive review of royal family charitable activities to ensure optimal public relations impact. "For months," Charles murmured. "This has been going on for 4 months. At least," Morrison confirmed. "This is only what I could find through official channels. There may have been informal discussions that weren't documented." Charles continued reading, his anger building with each page. There were emails discussing strategic repositioning of secondary royal activities, notes about maximizing their Majesty's charitable profile, and, most damning of all, a detailed analysis of Princess Anne's public appearances with recommendations for reducing potential overlap and competition. Competition, Charles said, his voice thick with disgust. They described my sister's work with sick children as competition. Morrison pointed to another document. This one is particularly troubling. It's a proposal for what they call charitable activity coordination, which essentially amounts to centralizing control over all royal family charitable engagements under the communications department. Charles read the proposal with growing horror. The plan was breathtakingly comprehensive in its scope and chilling in its implications. Under the guise of improving coordination, it would effectively give Camilla and her advisors veto power over every charitable activity undertaken by any member of the royal family. According to this, Charles said, and would need approval for hospital visits. Edward would need permission for his arts initiatives, and even William and Catherine would be subject to oversight for their charitable work. Yes, sir. The proposal frames it as ensuring brand consistency and maximizing impact, but the practical effect would be to give the Queen Consort's office unprecedented control over family activities. Charles set down the documents and leaned back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what his wife had attempted to orchestrate. This wasn't just about undermining Anne's Cardiff visit. It was about fundamentally restructuring the monarchy's approach to charitable work, with Camilla positioned as the ultimate arbiter of what was acceptable. Has this proposal been implemented in any way? He asked. Partially, Morrison replied, and Charles's heart sank. Several of the Princess Royal's recent difficulties can be traced back to directives that appear to have originated from this initiative. The Birmingham hospital visit, the Manchester Rehabilitation Center, even a Cardiff visit, all have been subject to what I can only describe as bureaucratic interference. And the staff involved, do they understand what they're participating in? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. I believe most of them think they're following legitimate directives aimed at improving efficiency. The communications have been carefully crafted to appear routine and administrative rather than strategic or personal. Charles stood up and walked to his window, a habit he had developed when trying to contain his emotions. The morning light revealed gardeners tending to the grounds, their work steady and purposeful, a stark contrast to the web of deception that had apparently been growing within his own household. There's something else, Morrison said hesitantly. Charles turned back to face him. More? I'm afraid so. It appears that external media consultants have been briefed on the royal family's charitable schedules and have been advised to direct coverage towards certain activities while downplaying others. Media manipulation, Charles said flatly. In essence, yes. The goal appears to be ensuring that Your Majesty and the Queen Consort receive the majority of positive coverage for charitable work, while other family members' activities are treated as secondary or subsidiary. Charles felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The implications extended far beyond family dynamics. This was about the integrity of the monarchy itself. If the press was being manipulated to present a false picture of who was actually doing the work of royal service, then the public was being deceived about the very nature of their constitutional system. Henry, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, I want you to take the following actions immediately. Morrison prepared to take notes. First, contact all departments and external consultants involved in this initiative. Inform them that it is canceled immediately and that any future attempts to implement similar measures will be considered insubordination. Yes, sir. Second, I want a complete audit of all charitable activities that have been affected over the past 6 months. If visits have been canceled or delayed due to this interference, I want them rescheduled immediately. Understood. Third, I want Sir Malcolm Hartwell in my office within the hour. And I want Camilla's private secretary present as well. Morrison hesitated. Sir, if I may, the Queen Consort's private secretary may not have been fully aware of the implications of what she was facilitating. Perhaps not, Charles said grimly. But she will be aware of them now. After Morrison left to carry out his instructions, Charles remained alone with the damning evidence spread across his desk. Each document represented not just a betrayal of trust, but a fundamental misunderstanding of what the monarchy was supposed to represent. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, and the decade she had spent carefully nurturing the royal family's relationship with the British people. She had understood that the monarchy's legitimacy rested not on publicity or media coverage, but on genuine service to the nation. Every member of the family contributed to that service in their own way, and each contribution was valued and respected. Camilla's initiative threatened to destroy that careful balance. By positioning herself and Charles as the primary focus of royal charitable work, she was essentially arguing that the other family members were expendable, that their decades of service and expertise could be subordinated to the demands of public relations strategy. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced Sir Malcolm Hartwell's arrival. Charles had encountered Hartwell numerous times since his appointment to the communications department, but he had never particularly warmed to the man. Hartwell was undoubtedly competent and well-connected, but he possessed the cold efficiency of someone who viewed human relationships as resources to be managed rather than bonds to be respected. Morrison entered first, followed by Hartwell and Camilla's private secretary, a nervous-looking woman named Margaret Whitfield who had served in various royal households for over a decade. "Sir Malcolm, Ms. Whitfield," Charles said, not bothering to invite them to sit. "I trust Henry has explained why you're here." Hartwell, to his credit, showed no signs of discomfort. "Your Majesty, if this is regarding the Charitable Coordination Initiative, I want to assure you that everything we've done has been in the best interests of a monarchy." "The best interests," Charles repeated. "According to whom?" "According to modern public relations best practices," Hartwell replied smoothly. "In today's media environment, it's essential to present a clear, consistent message about royal activities. The initiative was designed to ensure that Your Majesty receives appropriate credit for the excellent charitable work being done by the royal family." Charles felt his anger crystallizing into something harder and more dangerous. "And you determined that this required undermining my sister's activities." "Not undermining," Hartwell said quickly. "Coordinating. The Princess Royal's work is exemplary, but it needs to be positioned within the broader context of royal charitable activities." "Positioned by whom?" "You." For the first time, Hartwell seemed to recognize that he might be in serious trouble. "The initiative was developed in consultation with the Queen Consort's office and implemented with what we believe to be appropriate authority." Charles turned to Margaret Whitfield, who had grown progressively paler during the exchange. "Ms. Whitfield, what was your understanding of this initiative?" "Your Majesty," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I was told that we were implementing new procedures to improve coordination between royal offices. I didn't realize that it would affect other family members' activities. You didn't think to question why you were making inquiries about canceling Princess Anne's hospital visits?" I was told that we were exploring alternative arrangements that might be more beneficial for everyone involved." Charles looked between the two staff members, seeing in their faces the same willingness to follow orders without questioning the underlying ethics that had allowed this situation to develop. "Sir Malcolm," he said, his voice carrying the chill of Arctic wind, "you are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Your access to royal communications and scheduling systems will be terminated within the hour." Hartwell's composure finally cracked. "Your Majesty, surely we can discuss this. The initiative has shown promising results in terms of media coverage." "The initiative," Charles said, cutting him off, "has damaged relationships within my own family and compromised the integrity of our charitable work. Those are not results I consider promising." He turned to Whitfield. "Ms. Whitfield, you will prepare a complete report on every instruction you received regarding this initiative, including dates, times, and the exact wording of all communications. You will also personally contact every organization that was affected by canceled or delayed royal visits and explain that the royal family is committed to rescheduling at the earliest possible opportunity." "Yes, Your Majesty," she said, looking relieved that she wasn't being dismissed as well. After the staff members left, Charles found himself alone with Morrison and the weight of what he had just learned. The evidence was clear, the pattern was undeniable, and the betrayal was complete. Camilla had systematically worked to undermine other family members' charitable activities in order to enhance her own position, and she had used the royal staff and external consultants to accomplish her goals. "Sir," Morrison said carefully, "how do you wish to handle the Queen Consort's involvement in this matter?" Charles looked at his longtime aide, a man who had served the royal family with distinction and discretion for decades. Morrison had witnessed the ups and downs of royal marriages, the pressures of public life, and the complex dynamics that govern relationships within a monarchy. His question was not just about protocol. It was about the future of Charles's marriage and the stability of the institution they both served. "I need to speak with my wife," Charles said finally. "But first, I want you to contact Princess and inform her of everything we've discovered. She deserves to know the full extent of what's been happening. And the other family members who may have been affected, them as well. William, Catherine, Edward, they all need to understand what's been going on and that it stops now." Morrison nodded and prepared to leave, but Charles called him back. "Henry, in your years of service to this family, have you ever encountered anything like this before?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "Not exactly like this, sir. There have been tensions and disagreements, certainly, but I've never seen such a systematic attempt to manipulate family relationships for public relations purposes. And, in your professional opinion, can trust be rebuilt after something like this?" Morrison's pause spoke volumes. "That, Your Majesty, is a question that goes far beyond my area of expertise." After Morrison left, Charles remained in his study, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal. The morning sun that had seemed so promising just days earlier now felt harsh and unforgiving, casting sharp shadows across the documents that had destroyed his faith in the woman he had thought he knew. The third act of this family drama was about to begin, and Charles suspected that before it was over, nothing in his personal life would ever be the same again. The afternoon brought with it an oppressive weight that seemed to settle over Clarence House like a storm cloud waiting to break. Charles had spent the morning methodically working through the implications of what he had discovered, making the necessary phone calls to family members, and beginning the process of undoing the damage that Camilla's initiative had caused. Each conversation had been more difficult than the last, and had received the news with characteristic stoicism, though Charles could hear the hurt in her voice when she learned the full extent of the interference with her charitable work. William and Catherine had been shocked and concerned about the potential damage to family unity. Edward had been quietly angry, particularly when he learned that several of his arts-related initiatives had been delayed or modified without his knowledge. Now, as the clock approached 3 in the afternoon, Charles prepared for what would undoubtedly be the most difficult conversation of all. Camilla had been in meetings throughout the morning, unaware of the storm that had been building in her absence. Morrison had discreetly arranged for her afternoon schedule to be cleared, citing urgent family business that required her immediate attention. Charles stood in his study, looking out at the gardens where autumn was painting the leaves in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of the scene provided a stark contrast to the ugliness of the situation he was about to confront. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain diplomatic even in the most challenging circumstances, but this felt different. This was personal in a way that transcended politics or public perception. The sound of heels on marble announced Camilla's approach, and Charles turned from the window to face the door. She entered with her usual grace, but he could see the wariness in her eyes. The events of the morning had clearly reached her through various channels, and she knew that a reckoning was at hand. "Charles," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Henry said you needed to speak with me urgently." "Please sit down," Charles replied, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Camilla remained standing. "I prefer to stand, if you don't mind. I have a feeling this conversation might require it." Charles nodded and moved to stand behind his desk, the physical barrier between them suddenly feeling symbolic of something much larger. On the desk surface, the evidence of her betrayal was neatly organized in manila folders, a paper trail of deception that would be impossible to deny or explain away. "I've had an interesting morning," Charles began, his voice carrying a formal tone that Camilla would recognize as a warning sign. "I've learned a great deal about initiatives that have been undertaken in my name, without my knowledge, and contrary to my wishes. Charles, if this is about the Charitable Coordination Project, it is about a systematic campaign to undermine my sister's work," Charles interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "It is about the manipulation of royal staff, the interference with scheduled charitable activities, and the corruption of everything this family is supposed to represent." Camilla's composure began to crack around the edges. "That's not what it was about. You're making it sound far more sinister than it actually was." "Am I?" Charles picked up one of the folders and opened it. "Let me read you something from a memo dated 3 months ago. Princess Anne's high-profile charitable activities continue to generate disproportionate media coverage, potentially diminishing their Majesty's visibility in the charitable sector. Recommend strategic intervention to rebalance public perception." Camilla had grown very still, her face pale, but her chin raised in defiance. "Public perception matters, Charles. Like it or not, that's the reality of modern monarchy. And this..." Charles picked up another document. "Suggested talking points for media briefings. Emphasize that all royal charitable work is coordinated through and reflects the priorities of their majesties. Downplay individual initiatives that might compete for coverage. Media strategy is a legitimate concern," Camilla said, but her voice lacked conviction. Charles set down the papers and looked directly at his wife. "For months, Camilla, for months, you have been systematically working to undermine Anne's charitable activities. You've delayed hospital visits, canceled appearances, and manipulated media coverage. You've turned the staff into unwitting accomplices in a campaign of sabotage against my own sister." "Sabotage is a very strong word," Camilla protested. "I was trying to protect your position as king. I was trying to ensure that you receive the recognition you deserve for your leadership of the royal family. By diminishing Anne's work with sick children, by ensuring that your role as the head of the family is clearly understood by the public." Charles felt his carefully maintained control beginning to slip. "My role as head of the family includes supporting and respecting the contributions of every family member. It does not include allowing my wife to wage a secret war against my sister's charitable work." "Secret war?" Camilla's own anger finally surfaced. "I did nothing in secret. I worked with your staff, using your resources to develop a comprehensive strategy for maximizing the positive impact of royal charitable activities. You had Sir Malcolm Hartwell develop proposals that would have given you veto power over every charitable activity undertaken by any member of the royal family." Charles shot back. "That's not coordination. That's control. Someone needs to exercise control," Camilla said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how frustrating it is to watch your sister receive praise for visiting a children's hospital while your equally important work goes unnoticed?" The admission hung in the air between them like an accusation. Charles stared at his wife, finally, understanding the depth of her resentment and the extent of her ambition. "My work doesn't go unnoticed," he said quietly. "It receives exactly the recognition it deserves, based on its merit and impact." "That's naive, and you know it," Camilla replied. "Recognition is about positioning, about messaging, about making sure the right stories reach the right people at the right time. And has been doing this longer. She has established relationships with certain media outlets, and she benefits from a public perception that sees her as the hardworking princess. We had to level the playing field." "Level the playing field," Charles repeated, "by sabotaging her work, by ensuring that your accomplishments aren't overshadowed by hers." Charles walked around the desk to stand directly in front of his wife. "Do you hear yourself? Do you understand what you're saying? You're talking about my sister as if she's a competitor in some kind of game rather than a member of our family who has devoted her life to service." "She is a competitor," Camilla said, her mask of diplomatic restraint finally falling away completely. Whether you want to admit it or not, every time it appears in the newspaper for opening a children's ward or supporting a charity, it's a missed opportunity for you to be seen in that light. Every positive story about her charitable work is a story that could have been about yours. Charles felt something cold and final settle in his chest. This wasn't about misguided strategy or overzealous public relations efforts. This was about fundamental values, about what the monarchy meant, and about whether his wife understood the difference between service and self-aggrandizement. "You really believe that?" he said, more statement than question. "I believe that if you don't protect your own interests, no one else will," Camilla replied. "I believe that, and has had decades to build her reputation, and now it's your turn to be seen as the charitable leader of this family. At her expense, if necessary." The words created a silence so profound that Charles could hear his own heartbeat. In that moment, he understood that the woman standing before him had never truly grasped what it meant to be part of the royal family. She had approached their marriage and her role as queen consort as if it were a corporate merger, complete with market positioning and competitive analysis. "You've damaged relationships that took decades to build," he said finally. "You've corrupted the staff with your schemes, you've interfered with charitable work that benefits vulnerable people, and you betrayed the trust of family members who welcomed you into their lives." "I've tried to secure your legacy," Camilla insisted. "I've tried to ensure that when people think about royal charitable work, they think about King Charles III, not about his sister." "My legacy," Charles said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "was never supposed to be built on undermining my family." "Your legacy will be whatever we make it," Camilla replied. "And I'm trying to make it something magnificent." Charles turned away from her and walked back to the window, needing distance from the conversation and from the woman who had revealed herself to be so different from the person he thought he had married. "Do you love me?" he asked without turning around. The question seemed to catch Camilla off guard. "Of course I love you. Everything I've done has been because I love you." "No," Charles said, still looking out at the gardens. "Everything you've done has been because you love the idea of being queen consort. There's a difference. That's not fair, isn't it?" Charles turned to face her again. "If you loved me, you would have respected my values. You would have understood that my happiness comes from seeing my family succeed, not from diminishing their accomplishments. You would have known that using my staff to undermine my sister would be devastating to me. I thought you would understand once you saw the results," Camilla said, her voice becoming smaller. "I thought you would appreciate having a wife who was willing to fight for your interests. I never asked you to fight my family. Your family has never fully accepted me." Camilla shot back, some of her earlier fire returning, "and has always been polite but distant. William and Catherine have always treated me like an outsider. Edward barely acknowledges my existence. You were the only one who truly welcomed me, and I've been trying to protect that relationship ever since." Charles felt a flicker of sympathy for his wife, understanding for the first time the insecurity that had driven her actions. But sympathy could not excuse what she had done, and understanding could not rebuild the trust that had been destroyed. "You protected nothing," he said gently but firmly. "You've damaged the very relationship you were trying to preserve." "Charles, please," Camilla said, and for the first time in the conversation, her voice broke slightly. "We can fix this. We can find a way to move forward." "Can we?" Charles asked. "Can you honestly tell me that if I hadn't discovered what you were doing, you wouldn't have continued with this campaign? Can you tell me that Anne's Cardiff visit would have proceeded without interference?" Camilla was quiet for a long moment, and her silence was answer enough. "I thought so," Charles said, "which means that everything we've shared, everything we've built together, has been built on a foundation of deception." "That's not true," Camilla protested. "We've built something beautiful together. We've supported each other through difficult times. We've created a partnership that's stronger than either of us could have achieved alone." "A partnership," Charles repeated. "Is that what you call it when one partner systematically deceives the other?" "I call it protecting what matters most to me," Camilla said. "I call it ensuring that the man I love receives the recognition he deserves. And I call it betrayal of everything I hold dear." The conversation had reached an impasse, and both of them seemed to recognize it. Charles returned to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of his 70-plus years. Camilla remained standing in the center of the room, looking lost and uncertain in a way he had never seen before. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Charles looked at his wife, really looked at her, and tried to reconcile the woman he had loved with the woman who had orchestrated such an elaborate campaign of family sabotage. The task felt impossible. "Now," he said, "we figure out how to rebuild the relationships you've damaged. We restore Anne's confidence in the family's support for her work. We repair the staff's understanding of proper protocol. We undo every piece of your initiative and ensure that nothing like it ever happens again." "And us?" Camilla asked. "What about us?" Charles was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that would determine the course of the rest of their lives together. "I don't know," he said finally. "I honestly don't know." The fourth act of this family drama had reached its climax, but the resolution remained uncertain. As the afternoon shadows grew longer across the study floor, both Charles and Camilla understood that their marriage had been fundamentally altered by what had been revealed. Whether it could be repaired remained to be seen, but the trust that had once bound them together had been shattered, possibly beyond repair. The truth had finally emerged, and with it came the recognition that some betrayals cut too deep to be easily forgiven or forgotten. 2 weeks had passed since the devastating confrontation in Charles's study, and the atmosphere at Clarence House remained heavy with unspoken tensions and careful diplomacy. The royal household had settled into a new rhythm, one marked by professional courtesy, but lacking the warmth and easy familiarity that had once characterized daily life. Staff members moved through their duties with extra care, aware that they were navigating the aftermath of a family crisis that had shaken the very foundations of the monarchy. Charles had thrown himself into his royal duties with renewed intensity, as if by focusing completely on his responsibilities as king, he could somehow find clarity about his responsibilities as a husband. His public appearances had taken on an almost aggressive quality of normalcy, but those who knew him well could see the strain in his eyes and the careful way he measured his words when speaking about family matters. The morning of November 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of bright autumn sunlight that made everything appear sharper and more defined than usual. Charles stood in his dressing room, adjusting his tie and mentally preparing for what would be one of the most emotionally significant days since becoming king. Today was the day of Anne's visit to the Cardiff Children's Hospital, and he had made a decision that would send a powerful message to his family, his staff, and the public. Henry Morrison entered the dressing room, carrying Charles's official schedule for the day, but his expression suggested that he understood the deeper significance of what was about to unfold. "Good morning, Your Majesty," Morrison said, his usual professional demeanor tinged with something that might have been concern. "The car will be ready in 30 minutes for your departure to Cardiff." "Thank you, Henry," Charles replied, accepting the schedule, but not immediately reviewing it. "Has everything been arranged according to my specifications?" "Yes, sir. Your visit will be unannounced to the media, but coordinated with Princess Anne's office to ensure you arrive during her tour of the cardiac unit. The hospital administration has been briefed on your presence, but instructed to treat this as a family support visit rather than a formal royal engagement." Charles nodded, satisfied that his intentions would be clearly communicated through his actions rather than through any official statements or press releases. By appearing at the hospital alongside, and without fanfare or media attention, he would be sending an unmistakable message about where his loyalties lay and what he valued most about the monarchy's role in British society. "And the Queen Consort?" Morrison asked carefully. Charles paused in his preparations, his hands stilling on his jacket buttons. "The Queen Consort has her own schedule today. She's visiting the London Food Bank project as planned." "Of course, sir," Morrison replied, though both men understood the significance of the separate schedules. For the first time since their marriage, Charles and Camilla were undertaking charitable activities on the same day, without any coordination or joint appearances. The symbolism was unavoidable. As Charles finished dressing, his thoughts turned to the conversation he had had with and the previous evening. His sister had called to confirm the final details of her hospital visit, and their conversation had revealed just how much the past few weeks had affected the entire family dynamic. "I appreciate your support more than you know," and had said, her typically stoic voice carrying an unusual warmth. "The past few months have been challenging, and it means everything to know that you stand behind the work we've all committed our lives to." "You should never have had to question that support," Charles had replied. "And you should never have to question it again." The conversation had been brief but meaningful, and it had reinforced Charles's decision to make today's visit a powerful statement about family unity and shared values. Whatever challenges his marriage might be facing, his commitment to his family and their collective service to the nation remained unwavering. The drive to Cardiff took just over 3 hours, and Charles spent most of the journey in contemplative silence, watching the Welsh countryside roll past his window. The landscape was painted in the rich colors of autumn, and the changing seasons seemed to mirror the transformation that his own life was undergoing. Some changes were painful, like the loss of trust in his marriage, but others held the promise of renewal and growth. As the royal car approached Cardiff, Charles's thoughts turned to the children they would be visiting. The cardiac unit at Cardiff Children's Hospital serves some of the most vulnerable young patients in Wales, children whose lives have been disrupted by serious heart conditions that required complex treatment and long recovery periods, and have been supporting the hospital for over a decade, and her genuine affection for both the staff and the young patients had made her a beloved figure in the local community. The hospital appeared ahead of them, a modern facility that managed to convey both clinical efficiency and warm humanity. Charles could see the subtle signs of enhanced security that indicated his visit was already underway. Additional police officers in civilian clothes, carefully positioned vehicles, and the slightly heightened alertness that always accompanied royal visits. Morrison, who had been monitoring communications throughout the journey, turned to update Charles on the current situation. Princess Anne arrived on schedule and is currently in the cardiac rehabilitation wing. She's expected to move to the surgical recovery area in about 15 minutes. "Perfect timing," Charles said, feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. This would be the first time he and had appeared together publicly since the full scope of Camilla's interference had been revealed, and he wanted to ensure that their reunion conveyed the right message about family solidarity. The car pulled into the hospital's administrative entrance, away from the main public areas where Anne's official visit was taking place. Charles was met by the hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Sarah Williams, a woman in her 50s whose warmth and competence had made her a favorite among both staff and patients. "Your Majesty," Dr. Williams said with a respectful curtsy, "what a wonderful surprise. Princess, and will be delighted to see you." "I hope so," Charles replied. "I wanted to see firsthand the remarkable work you're doing here, and to support my sister's longtime commitment to your hospital." As they walked through the hospital corridors, Charles was struck by the atmosphere of controlled energy that characterized the pediatric facility. Nurses moved with purposeful efficiency. Doctors consulted over charts with intense focus, and despite the serious nature of the medical work being done, there was an underlying sense of hope and determination that pervaded every interaction. They approached the cardiac unit, and Charles could hear the sound of children's laughter mixed with adult voices engaged in gentle conversation. Through a partially open door, he caught sight of and sitting beside a young boy's bed, reading from a colorful picture book while the child's parents watched with grateful smiles. Dr. Williams knocked softly on the door frame and entered the room. "Your Royal Highness, I have a special visitor who would like to meet some of our patients," and looked up from the book, and, for a moment, surprise flickered across her face before being replaced by a smile of genuine pleasure. "Charles, What a wonderful surprise. She stood and approached him, and in that moment, all the careful protocol and royal formality fell away. They embraced as brother and sister, and Charles felt a sense of relief and rightness that had been missing from his life for weeks. "I wanted to see what you've been accomplishing here," Charles said as they separated, "and to remind myself why this work is so important to our family." Anne's eyes showed that she understood the deeper meaning of his words. "Come, let me introduce you to some remarkable young people." For the next 2 hours, Charles and moved through the hospital together, visiting with patients, speaking with medical staff, and observing the various programs that the royal patronage had helped to fund and develop. Charles was struck not only by the quality of the medical care being provided, but by the genuine relationships that and had built with everyone from the chief surgeon to the volunteer readers who came in to entertain the children. In the playroom of the cardiac unit, they met Emma, an 8-year-old girl who was recovering from her second heart surgery. Emma had been born with a complex congenital heart defect that required multiple procedures, and she had spent much of her young life in and out of hospitals. "Princess and comes to visit me every time I'm here," Emma told Charles with a matter-of-fact directness that only children possess. "She always brings new books, and she remembers which ones are my favorites," and knelt down beside Emma's wheelchair, her face soft with affection. "And what's your favorite book this week, darling?" "The one about the brave little mouse," Emma replied, "because even though he's small, he helps everyone in the forest." Charles watched his sister interact with Emma and felt a profound sense of pride mixed with shame. Pride in Anne's genuine compassion and decades of dedicated service, and shame that anyone, especially his own wife, could have viewed this work as something to be diminished or controlled. As they prepared to leave the playroom, Emma tugged on Anne's sleeve. "Princess, Anne, is the king going to come visit us again?" And looked at Charles, her expression questioning but hopeful. "I certainly hope so," Charles said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "In fact, I think I'd like to come back very soon. Would that be all right with you?" "Yes, please," Emma said with a grin that lit up her entire face. "And maybe next time you could bring the queen too." The innocent suggestion created a moment of awkward silence, and Charles felt the weight of his marital difficulties pressing down on him once again. But Anne, with her characteristic grace, stepped smoothly into the breach. "We'll see what we can arrange," she said gently. "For now, you focus on getting stronger so that when we come back, you can show us how well you're doing." As they left the hospital and walked back toward their respective cars, Charles and had their first private conversation since the crisis had begun. "Thank you," and said simply, "for coming today, for supporting this work, and for making it clear where you stand." "I'm sorry it was ever in doubt," Charles replied, "and I'm sorry you had to endure months of interference and questioning about work that should have been celebrated, not undermined," and was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. "Charles, I know this has been difficult for you personally, and I don't want to see your marriage damaged because of misunderstandings about my activities." "They weren't misunderstandings," Charles said firmly. "They were deliberate attempts to diminish your work, and I won't pretend otherwise." "Perhaps not," Anne said, "but marriages require forgiveness and compromise, and I don't want to be the cause of permanent damage to yours." Charles stopped walking and turned to face his sister. "And you have done nothing wrong. You have served this family and this country with distinction for over 50 years. If my marriage cannot survive my insistence on supporting your work, then it was built on a foundation too weak to sustain the weight of real partnership. And if it can't survive," and asked, "what then?" Charles considered the question that had been consuming his thoughts for weeks. "Then, Camilla, and I will need to have some very serious conversations about values, priorities, and what we expect from each other going forward. Trust can be rebuilt, but only if both parties are committed to the hard work of rebuilding it." As they reached their cars, and placed a gentle hand on her brother's arm. "I hope you can find a way forward that doesn't require you to choose between your family and your wife." "So do I," Charles replied. "But if that choice is forced upon me, you should know where my loyalties lie." The drive back to London gave Charles time to reflect on everything he had witnessed and experienced during the hospital visit. The children he had met, the medical staff he had spoken with, and the genuine impact of royal support on their work had reinforced his conviction that charitable service was the true heart of what the monarchy represented. But more than that, seeing and in her element, comfortable, competent, and genuinely loved by the people she served, had reminded him of why he had always admired his sister and why her work was so essential to the royal family's continued relevance. As the car approached London in the gathering dusk, Charles made a decision that would shape not only his marriage, but his entire approach to kingship going forward. Whether Camilla could accept and support his vision remained to be seen, but he would not compromise on the fundamental values that defined both his personal character and his understanding of royal duty. The final act of this family drama was about to begin, and Charles was prepared to face whatever consequences his choices might bring. The truth had been revealed, the battle lines had been drawn, and now it was time to determine what kind of king and what kind of man he was truly meant to be. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, Charles felt that he was traveling in the right direction. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the confidence that comes from knowing one's own heart and the determination that comes from defending what matters most. As London's lights began to twinkle in the distance, Charles thought about Emma's innocent question about bringing the Queen to visit. Whether that would ever be possible remained to be seen, but he was committed to ensuring that the work itself, the vital, compassionate, essential work of serving those who needed it most, would continue without interference, without compromise, and without apology. The story would continue to unfold in the days and weeks ahead, but this chapter had ended with clarity about what mattered most and resolve about how to protect it. For Charles, that was enough to build on whatever the future might bring.